Hi everyone, I'm Natalie Alexander. Welcome to the Commons here at the UN Library and Archives, Geneva, and to our playlist, The Journey to the Summit of the Future. Here at the library, one part of our mission is to support and encourage understanding of multilateralism. And we created this playlist to have a space to explore some of the substance and the research feeding into the summit as we look to the kinds of multilateralism we need for our future. We've looked at young people and how to genuinely include youth in multilateral processes. We've looked at intersectionality and how this can be applied across UN programs and policies. We've looked at having a new eco-social contract. How can we ensure countries can develop sustainably while facing crippling levels of debt? And we've also looked at how we can rebuild trust in multilateralism. There's a lot more we can cover, but as the summit draws nearer, this is our final episode, and we wanted to look really at what to expect at the summit. With us today is Dr. Adam Day. He's from the UN University Center for Policy Research. Dr. Day, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Natalie.
Before we kind of jump into looking at the summit and the research, our first question to you is about the center. So you're the head of the Geneva Office for the UN University Center for Policy Research. What is it here to achieve?
So the Center for Policy Research, in broad terms, is like an extra brain for the UN system. And what we try to do is provide an independent research capacity so that what the multilateral system does is based on better evidence and a better understanding of what's likely to make a difference. And a lot of that includes supporting the Secretary General's agenda. So when he wanted to write the Common Agenda report, we stepped up and supported that process. When he created this high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, we stepped in to support that. And I think the best way to think of it is we're really a think tank that's focused on improving the multilateral system.
Yeah, you mentioned HLAB, the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism. We've talked a lot about the recommendations that have been put forward by HLAB as part of this playlist of conversations. You led a lot of the support from the center into the research and the recommendations for the summit. One of, I guess, the big questions that we have is how do we take, research, academic thought on international policy and bring forward recommendations that are actionable at a summit like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because I think if you go back several years to the Common Agenda report, there were 80 plus recommendations there. You've got 11 policy briefs, you've got the report ourselves. If you count it all up, there are hundreds of ideas. And in the end, not all of them are going to stick. And some of them won't stick not because they're not good ideas, but because member states won't be ready to take them on. And I think getting that sweet spot of an idea that's ready and ripe and effective and that member states are ready to take on is a kind of magic Goldilocks formula that we don't get right very often. I do think there are a few areas where we're likely to have some progress based on a combination of what the HLAB did, what the Secretary General said, and what member states have been talking about. But it's not very many issues, actually, when you get down to it.
Could you share what you think those issues are?
Yeah, and this won't be a full list, but I think in the area of digital space in particular, there was a set of recommendations around artificial intelligence and creating safe, inclusive digital space that showed up in the Common Agenda report. There are specific recommendations on how to do that in the HLAB report. The UN Technology Envoy, Amandeep Gill, led a process that is producing a compact that will be attached. And I think that what we see is a kind of convergence of, first of all, risks, member states understanding there needs to be a kind of common approach to the kind of fast-moving technology. And I think there is a kind of political space to reach an agreement in the summit. That's one. I think another one is the financial system. The Secretary General has been very clear that the financial architecture is unfair, unfit for today's problems. The HLAB report made some very specific recommendations about how to recalibrate and reform that. And I think you see other initiatives like the Bridgetown Initiative that's really pushing for a different approach to the financial system. I don't think the summit will do that, but it will, I think, accelerate progress on the financial system. And then I think the third area that's worth probably flagging is this idea of long-term future risks and future generations. Now, this idea of supporting and protecting future generations has been around for many, many decades, hundreds of years if you go back far enough. But I think this is a moment where you have a summit called Summit for the Future, you have a declaration on future generations, you have the potential for very specific things like a future generations envoy, and I think that is a moment that we need to take as well. So those would be three kind of concrete areas where you've got member states, HLAB, Secretary General, a lot of other things coming together in a positive way, I hope.
Yeah. One of the expected big outcomes is a new pact for the future, to be an outcome of the summit. Having contributed to the research and the substance recommended to member states and the Secretary General, and seeing that the draft pact is publicly available now, what is your first impression of the draft?
Yeah, I mean, my first impression is really impressed and grateful that Namibia and Germany took on what could have been thought of as a bit of a poison chalice. You know, you've got some of the worst geopolitical situation we've seen in our lifetime, and they took on the role of co-facilitating a very fractured process. And I think where we are now at Rev 2, we're not there yet, but we have Rev 2 as it's being called, is a pact that I think does three things. One is it has a lot of reiteration and reaffirmation of things we've already committed to. IHL and peace and security and all of these things that we all know. And critics will say that isn't good enough, and I agree. That by itself isn't good enough, but at a time when you've got acts of aggression, where you've got a lot of backsliding on some of the basics on human rights, I think a reaffirmation is actually an important thing. And so I wouldn't dismiss the we recommit, we reconfirm language, even though it's not enough. I think the second thing that we've got is a couple initiatives that are concrete, like the Digital Compact, like the push for financial system reform, that I don't think you can go back from at this point. Doesn't mean we'll get all the way there. I don't think there'll be huge sums of money produced at the summit to deliver on the financial system, but I do think you've got a kind of package of things that you could say, these will be more or less deliverables at the summit. And then I think the third thing, and maybe the most exciting thing, is you've got a couple big principles that are being put forward. And one of those principles, and the word rights of future generations has fallen out of the latest draft. I'm disappointed in that. And that's not in the declaration or the pact, the two documents. But I think that idea that future generations, people that haven't been born yet, have some sort of standing and need to be represented in the multilateral system is more like a normative point that maybe 10 years from now, we can look back on and say that created a kind of cascade across the system. And similarly to when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed, it's not like torture stopped the next day, but over the decades after torture was prohibited in that, you see a kind of infrastructure build around that norm. And now you have a bunch of capacities to stop torture. What I hope is 10 years from now, we have a similar kind of infrastructure built around future generations and a capacity to do that long-term planning to prevent really large-scale harm to them. So I think those are the three kinds of things we could see at the summit.
Yeah. Mentioning the rights of future generations as something that's currently missing in the draft pact, is there anything else from your research and contribution to the recommendations that you see is critically missing?
There's a big one, and it's in flashing lights, and I think some of your previous speakers have covered it, and it's the environment. The environment structurally in the UN system is subordinated to development in many respects. It doesn't have a standalone pillar in the pact or the declaration process. Member states have largely agreed that most things on climate and the environment will be taken care of in other venues like the COP process and the various treaties. I think that's a strategic mistake. I think you can't have a global agreement on the future that doesn't have a much more specific focus and set of deliverables on the environment. Now, there are some kind of recommitments too, but the big gap between what the science is telling us about what's happening to our environment, the thresholds and tipping points that we're crossing, and the fairly muted commitments that are in the current draft, I think that's going to be a glaring problem when it comes to telling especially young people, but all people, that this is a pact for the future.
Part of the multilateral process is summits, conferences, agreements, treaties. There is also criticism that in our recent history, these kinds of meetings and pacts are not producing the results we need for a fairer, safer, more prosperous world. What do you think the summit and the pact will achieve realistically at this point in time?
There's a very kind of glib answer, which is nothing. On day one, nothing will change just because everybody came together. And I think that expecting a summit to do something beyond a kind of convergence of views is unrealistic. I don't want to diminish it, but I think that we need to understand that this is really a moment where you're not going to have a binding agreement. This isn't a treaty. This isn't going to be legally enforceable. But it can have a powerful effect if it's followed up on. And I do think that some of these commitments to creating a kind of converged process around emerging technologies and risks, potentially around peace and security, although it's not very strong in the Pact right now, certainly around financing the SDGs and moving beyond the SDGs. I do think that it can add momentum that you couldn't get in any other format than a summit. And I do think that one of the big benefits that we have in this summit, which isn't in previous summits per se, is the Secretary General has actually done these 11 policy briefs that have very concrete ideas in them. And it could be that after the summit, we can pick some of those back up. We can say, okay, well, we've done a bit of triage. Member states have kind of set a course of direction, and we can pick some of these ideas in the HLAB report or the policy briefs up. For example, an emergency platform to deal with the next global crisis, or a specific set of financial reforms that might not be in the Pact per se, but the ideas are there in a very specific form and they can be picked up. And that's what I think is exciting about this summit, is there's a lot of material to draw from.
Yeah, all this research and the recommendations move beyond the summit. After the summit, how do we make sure that after 2 days there is impact from what is achieved?
Yeah, and the key word I think that you mentioned is we, because you and I will not have a major role in shaping this, and we can be advocates, and there's this kind of idea of a third UN, which is this circle of actors around it and academics. And I do think that what has been done in the lead up to the summit is to give member states a pretty robust menu of options to choose from. For me, the difference between a succeeding summit and a failing one in the long term is a few things. One is really concrete follow-up. It's nice to talk about future generations. We need an envoy, we need a reporting mechanism, we need funds to go into that. And there needs to be a process that holds these actors accountable to those commitments. Nice to talk about ending our dependence on fossil fuels. That needs to have a concrete accountability follow-up. And so I think what I'll be looking for in the days immediately following the summit is a couple of things. One is, where's the money going? Are there commitments to funding some of these initiatives? And two is, are there clear and transparent accountability measures that have been agreed to, so that the following year we can say, yes, member states have or they haven't. And I think that in the absence of a treaty or anything legally binding, that's probably the kind of the two sets of teeth we can give to this. One is putting the money into these initiatives, and the second thing is a transparent and accountable and way of measuring whether we're actually doing it.
Yeah, Adam, thank you so much for being here today. Our final question to you is, what do you hope people will take away from this moment in time, this summit, as a world, as a society?
Yeah, so I mean, very concretely, I think what you can take away from this summit is that member states at one of the worst times in our living history are going to come together and say some fairly strong things about what they'll work together on. And my message to the public would really be, find ways to hold member states accountable for those commitments. Don't give up just because things look bleak on the peace and security or the environment front. I think my experience in the lead up to this has been that we are at a moment in history where civil society and young people are not willing to back down and just take the status quo. And this is a moment to publicly hold them accountable for that.